Hi, I'm really excited to bring this Christ Revealed interview to you. Let's go ahead and jump in. In your lifetime, there have been discoveries that have been, corroborating, in nature as far as what the discovery was and what was said in the Bible. Mm-hmm. So, is there any that stand out to you?
There's a number that have been found. One was actually shortly before my lifetime, but one of my favorites was years ago in the Harvard Theological Review. There was a professor who wrote and said there's astonishingly little evidence that the feet of a crucified person was ever pierced by nails.
Right.
So all of the crucified victims that we found had been crucified with ropes.
Right.
That seemed to contradict the biblical account, especially in John when Thomas says, I want to see the nail marks in your hands and in your feet. So does the Bible contradict the archaeological record? Well, in 1967, about a decade before I was born, a man who's been named Yehohanan was found in the middle of the first century in Palestine, and he was crucified in the way that is described happened to Jesus. Now, there's still some scholarly debate whether or not his legs were actually broken, as it describes in John chapter 19. So that's unconfirmed, but nails were used that shows John accurately described the way crucifixion took place in that place and at that time. So to me, as the archaeological record continues, we just kind of come across these findings that slowly corroborate the biblical story.
And with that, an area of focus for you has been the fate of the apostles. Mm-hmm. So why did you decide to write on that, and why did that become an area of focus for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I grew up hearing apologetics in the defense of the faith, and one of them was that all the apostles, except probably John, died these grisly deaths because they refused to recant their belief that they had seen the risen Jesus. Right. Therefore, it's true. And there's a power to that. Why would somebody intentionally die for something they knew was false? Mm-hmm. Well, a few years ago, I was taking a group of students up to Berkeley where we invited in some skeptics to speak to our Christian students. And I teach my students how to ask good questions and just interact with people with very different belief systems.
So, okay, that's fascinating. So you basically say, I'm going to take these students
yeah.
who, we're trying to, they've come here with an agenda to learn, and, we want to shape them. And one of your methodologies in doing that is to put them in front of some skeptics and let them. So you're not afraid of the other side of the argument.
No, these are high school students. In fact, we've had students down to 12 and 13 years
wow.
old
So
go with us.
Wow, okay.
We'll bring in leading atheists, leading skeptics, leading people from very different worldviews. Now, we train our students very carefully, and we go with them and we debrief afterwards. But I'm not afraid to expose my students to contrary ideas.
I think that's
awesome. Got to train them well.
Yeah,
they usually walk away more confident once they've seen the pushback, and then we make sense of it. So we're on this trip, and I had a friend of mine who was arguing, he's what you might call a mythicist, argues Jesus didn't even exist. And one of our students said, well, why would all the apostles die if Jesus didn't exist? And he pushes back, he goes, give me evidence that any of them actually died. And this was about 7 or 8 years ago. My students all look at me like I'm supposed to have the answer. And I sat there and I thought, I don't really know. I've just taken it second, third hand from other people. I've never looked into this myself. And I was in a doctoral program looking for a doctoral thesis topic. So it hit me that night. I'm like, this is perfect. I have to know for myself if this is really a good argument. And I imagine other people are going to be pretty interested too. So that night, I pretty much decided I was going to start writing on that if my committee would approve it.
So what was that journey like once you started making that your doctoral thesis?
Well, when you write a doctoral thesis, I had to be careful not to start off and say, I want to prove that they all died as martyrs to make this argument. There's a temptation to that, and I had to consistently fight back on that because that's the only way to be scholarly objective and be fair to the evidence and really ask, is this a good argument? What's the evidence they died as martyrs? Can we really believe they were eyewitnesses of Jesus? And if this is true, what's the best way to make the argument? So it began by just kind of mentally shifting rather than just making an apologetic, really asking the question as fairly as I could. And I told my wife, I'm like, I've got to be willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads.
Right.
Is this a good argument? So I just started, I literally started by Googling just to see what people were saying.
Right.
Didn't get much out of that.
Right.
Then I started doing journal researches, I looked at books, I called scholars. I mean, you just become a detective,
Right.
and you trace every single, footnote you can until you feel like you've exhausted the evidence that's out there, and then you try to assess it as fairly as you can.
And where did it lead you? What were some of the highlights?
Well, some of the highlights, I would say basically, I decided to study the 12 apostles with Matthias instead of Judas, and then James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul, because they're such significant figures in the early church, and they're both eyewitnesses of Jesus, and both not believers in Jesus during their lifetime. And I think we can conclude with confidence that at least James, the brother of Jesus, James, the son of Zebedee, Peter, and Paul, we have good historical evidence that they died as martyrs. I think a decent case can be made for Thomas and for Andrew. I think the rest, to be honest with you, it's hard to know when history ends and when legend begins. We just don't know. For example, the story is that Bartholomew was skinned alive. This is the tradition we often hear. Well, the earliest record that I could find is about 500 AD. Now, that doesn't mean it's false, but historically speaking, we can't have much confidence in that being true. Not to mention, when it comes to Bartholomew, there's a number of different traditions about where he went and how he died, about 5, 6, 7 different traditions.
Right.
So I'm looking at this saying, I don't think, historically speaking, we can have a lot of confidence that Bartholomew died that way.
Right.
So when I ratcheted it back, I said, okay, what really matters here? I said, well, the first thing is we have good, early, consistent evidence that the apostles were eyewitnesses of Jesus. That's why they believed. We see it in all 4 Gospels. We see this distinctly in Paul's writings, like 1 Corinthians chapter 15. We see it in extra biblical writings. Church fathers like Clement of Rome and Ignatius talking about that. So very early, the consistent record is the apostles saw with their own eyes.
Right.
Second, we know at the heart of their faith was the resurrection. There is no early Christian faith apart from belief in the resurrection. There's some critics who will say, in the 2nd century, this resurrection begins to emerge, but it wasn't at the heart. Well, this just simply isn't true. The earliest account we have in 1 Corinthians 15, which is at least 2 decades after the death of Jesus. And I think he's passing on a creed that he received earlier, probably within 3 to 5 years of the death of Jesus. Paul says, I pass on you what was most important, that Jesus died, he was buried, he rose on the 3rd day. The early, consistent testimony is that to be a Christian was to believe in the resurrection. I mean, read the book of Acts. When they start proclaiming and preaching the message of Jesus, it's about the resurrection. So the Gospels are eyewitnesses. Second, we know that they were proclaiming the resurrection. Third, we see persecution. I decided to read through the New Testament and pay attention to every single book when either somebody was persecuted or Jesus taught that someone would be persecuted for their faith. I was stunned and partly disappointed how much I had missed this before. At the heart of Jesus' message is pick up your cross and follow me.
Right.
Now, sometimes we say, pick up your cross. My neighbor listens to loud music. My son is disobedient. Well, that's not what he meant. He meant pick up your cross and be ready to die. It's over Paul's writing. It's over James' writing. It's in Hebrew, this consistent message. You proclaim Jesus, persecution is coming. But then we see this outside of the church in writings like Tacitus and in Pliny the Younger, that when people proclaim the message of Jesus publicly, they were persecuted. So if we take a step back, what does this tell us? You have a group of people who believe they had seen the risen Jesus. The first thing they proclaim is the resurrection. We have reason to believe that if people were proclaiming the resurrection, persecution was very likely. And then we look at the individual apostles. What do we find? We find some good evidence for Peter. 1st century evidence that he died as a martyr. Same for Paul. And I think same for both James. So the key is not so much that we can show that all of the apostles died as martyrs. The key is that they sincerely believed that Jesus was risen from the grave and were willing to suffer and die. That's the key.
Thanks so much for joining us for this interview, for taking this Christ Revealed journey with us. Remember, if you haven't already, subscribe. That way you'll get notified about all the new content that's coming down the road. Comment. People want to hear from you, and then maybe you'll encourage somebody else to make a comment. If you did like it, like it so other people know that it's something good for them to watch. And finally, share this. Send links to other people that you know and care about. Cost you nothing but maybe a few seconds of your time, but it might have a massive impact on their life. Anyway, really excited to be able to share this information with you. Thanks for tuning in.